All right, we're going to go ahead and kick this off. I want to thank everybody for joining my session this morning. It was a wild reach, and a few months ago I submitted a talk track to get discounted admission. I think I've learned my lesson on that with the size of this room. But the idea was going to be to do a high-minded presentation on the challenges that we face with users and their curious attachments to passwords. It was actually born out of several events that I attended over the last couple of years where people like myself were building policies to try to isolate workloads so that users couldn't access resources that would expose businesses to risk based on their authentication capabilities. But the challenge that I kept seeing with all of these speeches is that they were all entirely system-centric. None of them addressed at all the fact that there are human beings that are actually involved in this process of authenticating to our systems. So I kind of tried to take it from a different perspective and look at the people that we are hired to protect, the people that we are hired to empower, and address the challenges that they have seen over their lifetimes that have been culturally ingrained for literally thousands of years around how they protect identities and what we can do. And at the time, when I submitted the talk back in February, it was entirely theoretical. Microsoft had just begun looking at some abilities to evaluate authentication strength. We had the ability to assign different authentication capabilities and methods to different users, but we couldn't really do a whole lot with it. And unfortunately, February was approximately 1 million years ago now, because in that time, it's been turned into a checkbox in the conditional access policy. So this is now a product announcement, right? And that's just unfortunately how things change over time, right? So what we're going to do instead of turning this into just a product announcement is we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that users face, how those challenges have been ingrained into them over time, some of the capabilities that we have in enabling protections for our critical workloads while also addressing the human beings that they're designed to protect. And this is going to continue to evolve, and some of these things have been going live and into general availability over the last 48 hours even. So a lot of what I'm going to be doing is looking at notes, and my apologies because I want to engage with every single one of you, but I was literally testing limits of this stuff up until 11:30 last night. So it's been quite a ride. So, a little bit about us as an organization. Synergy Technical was a born-in-the-cloud consulting company in Richmond, Virginia. We were established in 2011. We deal with clients all over the world. We deal with productivity, security, managed services with strong Microsoft focus, and that's kind of where my background really is. We got the Microsoft 365 Security Deployment Partner of the Year award in 2020. Literally weeks before the pandemic started, we flew to San Francisco and said, look at that ship. That's the weird hospital ship out there. And then it just sort of followed me back home. We've done all sorts of fun stuff all around the world. Again, 3 million plus cloud users experienced in over 70 countries, and we've done companies of all shapes and sizes. A little bit about me. I actually have been Mac-free since 1998. Thank you. Yeah, that was a long and arduous journey. But immediately threw myself into the Microsoft world, got my MCSE in NT4, which is still valid. Check your certs. Yeah, that's right, valid for life, right? In fact, my CompTIA A+ and Network Plus at the time said they were valid for life too, so, yeah. Anyway, I spent 7 years doing identity and Windows systems management at DoD, at DSCR down the road, and went from that into publicly traded manufacturing company, and was there when I first experienced the cloud. And that was not fun because my boss came to me and said, hey, you know how we do Lotus Notes 7? We're not going to do that anymore. It's yours, and you got to figure out what to do with it. And that was in 2010, and we looked at several different solutions. We called Microsoft and said, do you have a mechanism for migrating Lotus Notes 7 to BPOS, which was the predecessor to Office 365? At the time, it was hosted on Exchange 2007, and they actually laughed. The engineer on the phone actually laughed at me. We did actually manage to get it done, and we moved to Intune the next year. We were one of the first customers on the East Coast to install and deploy Intune back when Silverlight was still a pretty neat idea. You can follow me on all my different places. Caution about the YouTube stuff. It's mostly bike racing videos. I tend to engage in very inconvenient hobbies. But I also tend to ride my bike and talk about IT stuff a lot. So it kind of gets me out in the wild, clears my head. I'm not in the office, not thinking about things that are distracting. So Anyway, all of that said, let's dig into it. So what is identity, right? This actually was stolen from a deck I did as a co-presentation with Microsoft a few years ago where we were talking about decentralized identity. What is identity at its core? For users, we have taught them for literally thousands of years that identity is a combination of two things, right? It's the traditional credential pair. It's some sort of a presentable, visible username and some sort of hidden, hashed, secret value, a password or something along those lines. And I say thousands of years because it really, oops, I didn't play the animation, darn it. It has been thousands of years because for 6,000-ish years or so, ancient civilizations have used indications of identity in rich fabrics, in crowns, in mitres and robes, and all sorts of other things for people to present the identity of who they are. We see across the world, we see tribal tattoos that indicate the history of a clan, tartans that indicate the history of a clan, right? Achievements of humanity were tied to the identity of who we were. And when Microsoft first entered this space, and again, just full disclosure, my whole background is at Microsoft, so these things may apply to other vendors, but I can't speak to that. So when Microsoft first entered the compliance arena back in 2017 or so, the first line on this deck got created, and this was a discussion about how identities evolved to service a necessary relationship between individual peoples, governments, and organizations, right? Identities originally existed for people to prove who they were or to be proved to by a government. We added organizations into that mix later on. We added in things like birth certificates and census data, which if you actually study the history of Babylon, it's insane that they had census data because they had no numerical system. That's crazy, right? But they managed to do it. The Roman era introduced birth certificates and the first recorded written records of who people were and what was important to them and how they identified in society. We moved through all the way forward to photo IDs and things like the digitization of paper records and the introduction of an international fingerprint system, which if you think about it, is a little bit nuts. Because we're actually still telling people now to use that as a reliable biometric as an authentication mechanism, but it's also the presentation layer. A little bit suspect, right? And we'll come back to why users then, as a result of that, don't really trust biometrics. But along the same time that we've been developing these systems of identification, we've also been producing these systems of attestation, or the secret part of it. And we look back over, again, thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians were the first to use locks, physical locks. They had a wooden lock with a single tumbler. If it broke, oops, right? And at the same time, we saw the first introduction of recorded use of passwords is actually in the Bible in the 11th century BCE in the book of Judges. There was a war between the Gileadites and the Ephraimites, and one of the groups couldn't pronounce the sound sh. They only had a s. And so as the retreating army was trying to cross the River Jordan, people would stop them and ask them to pronounce the word shibboleth. And if they said Sibboleth, oops, right? And this is actually now considered the first linguistic password, the first linguistic authenticator. It did not end well for those who were retreating. Unfortunately, this event was also a mass casualty event to the tune of about 42,000 people, but hey, it got written down. And it became sort of an archetype for how we define access and protecting access to not just resources, but also to places, to protecting our identity and saving our lives, honestly. So we look at locks developing with keys and moving in through the Roman era where we start to see metal locks because we realize there's a real value to being able to put a lock on a chest, and going all the way through up to the 1970s, or actually the 1800s, where we had the introduction of the first flat modern physical key, and now even the little security key that you may carry in your pocket, right? There's a direct line of attachment to, there's a physical item I need to protect, and it comes all the way back from 6,000 years ago in ancient Egypt with a wooden lock. But at the same time, we've also been developing more capable password requirements, right? So for 3,000 years, we've been talking about passwords, right? They're really super cool. You can do such amazing things. You can save your life if you can pronounce this word correctly. You can get access to your banking information. You can use daily watchwords with daily rotations. In ancient Rome, commanders would write down a word on a wooden tablet, hand it out to their lieutenants, who would then take it to watch posts, and every day that wooden tablet would be burned and a new one would be issued. So there was daily rotations. And Paul Asdorian set me up perfectly for this, so I really appreciate him putting some Star Wars stuff up there. There is no way in Roman history that Han, Luke, and Leia would have made the Endor surface, right? It's an older code, sir, but it checks out. Would never have happened, not even in ancient Rome. Then we move forward and we look into other ways that passwords have been used, and it's actually only into 1961 that we see our first need for a digital password in a computer system, and it was only because there were more than one person using that actual physical computer system, right? There wasn't really a need for it if it was just yours. And then in 1974, just 13 years later, we're seeing passwords baked into the operating system of Unix. It's only 9 years later that RSA receives their patent for cryptogram or crypto system, and then only again just a few years after that we start to see this release of Kerberos 5, which is important because it's the first publicly exportable implementation of a secure authentication protocol designed for non-secure networks, right? Up until that point, everything was designed that you had to be on the network that you were authenticating to. So we weren't really super concerned about passwords. And actually, in 1993, things were pretty simple for us, right? I was just starting my first year in college, and a couple of friends of mine and I who had Macs were really excited that we had managed to take an AppleTalk network connection with RJ11 cable, snake it over the door, run across 2 or 3 dorm rooms, and we could actually share a file. It took the better part of an hour to send that file, but it was amazing, right? We weren't concerned about security. Most of us in 1993, if we had a computer at all, it was probably to make book reports and print them out at home, right? So the concept of securing our digital access wasn't really important to us. Most of our computers were single-user instances. When we did start worrying about passwords a few years later, for a lot of us, the story was pretty common, right? Active Directory was new and shiny and came out of the box with pre-canned password policies that in retrospect were not super great. And actually, the crazy thing about this is an actual Windows 2000 pre-canned default domain policy, okay? I can walk into 100 organizations and I will still see that in use today in at least 20% of them, right? In some cases, what I might see is that the maximum password age has been raised to 60, right? Now, one little bit of Active Directory password trivia. The default policy specifies 7 characters. Does anybody know why? What was special about that length, though? Every hash was 7 characters, right? So the default password policy in Active Directory said, let's just use one little hash, right? And so you saw this big push almost immediately for everybody to go to 8 characters, simply because it produced 2 hash values. Now your password is literally twice as hard to crack because you simply added an additional number. And we felt the impact on the admin side for years because they immediately went to 15 characters just to add that 3rd hash, just to make it super gooder, right? So we turned on Active Directory 23 years ago now. Actually, I think it was 24 that Windows 2000 was officially released. And we just kind of let it run, which even at that low bar was a fundamentally disruptive event. This was the first time that we had asked users at a large scale to implement passwords to protect their access to systems, right? You look at traditional like Windows for Workgroups kind of stuff, and you're still generally just authenticating to your own personal device. It really didn't matter if you protected it at scale. This was the first time, and we actually saw so many admins beat back into submission that they would wait till another 8 years later for fine-grained password policies to offer some glimmer of hope. But how many of us actually implemented and were successful with fine-grained password policies? I see very few hands. I see very few hands, right? So after we spent, let's call it now 17 years, and we finally convinced users to put a special character in their daughter's name and a 1 on the end, NIST releases 800-63B. Appendix A, right, for those playing the home game. And I will apologize, there's a lot of text on these slides, and the slides will be available later. You review them. The documents are out there. They're public record, right? Super easy. But what this document did was it really frustrated a lot of us. We had spent 17 years trying to train our users who'd spent 3,000 years learning that passwords are super cool and putting them and getting them to finally use a special character, and then told them, that's not important. You just need really long passwords. And actually, the document, I even cut out the part here where it said, within reason, and it said passwords of multiple megabytes in size might be inconvenient. Right? I mean, the full published works of Shakespeare may be a pretty good password, but ultimately it's going to be very difficult for a user to remember. But that's what they were really driving at, right? This document was really talking about the challenges associated with getting users to remember passwords. Because when users don't remember passwords, they tend to do pretty predictable things, right? So it was January of 2018 when this guy pushed the big no-no button and told Hawaii that they were under imminent missile attack. And while that itself got a lot of the news, the file photo that was taken of him in 2014 was published to the internet to accompany stories about who this guy is, right? And obviously you could, well, I don't know, it's not the super clearest thing, but the password was warning point 2 if anybody wants to jot that down. And you know, at the time, we, those of us in the room, would have probably chuckled at that and said, well, password expiration is going to get that guy. But if it's warning point 2, it was warning point 1. Right? And if we take our simple concept of this guy is a government employee, and government employees have predictable password rotation rates, is it 60 or 90 days? Can anybody tell me right now? Right? 90? Okay, so 90 days from 2014, it was reasonable to have assumed in January of 2018 when that photo was taken that it was probably warning point 13 or 14, right? So, right, that's bad, right? And again, we would assume that his password rotation would have taken care of that, except that literally the next year, in May of 2019, Microsoft removed password expiration recommendations from the final version of the security baselines for Windows Server. And this is a great document. I really, really, really encourage anybody who has struggled with Microsoft documentation to go back and read what they write now, because it is very different from the tone that they used to take. This guy was given a long leash and had clearly gotten quite tired of explaining this argument. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the top second column here, okay? Periodic password expiration is a defense only against the probability that a password or hash will be stolen during its validity interval and will be used by an unauthorized entity. If a password is never stolen, there's no need to expire it. And if you have evidence that a password has been stolen, you would presumably act immediately rather than wait for expiration to fix the problem. If it's a given that a password is likely to be stolen, how many days is an acceptable length of time to continue to allow the thief to use that stolen password? The Windows default is 42 days. Doesn't that seem like a ridiculously long time? Well, it is, and yet our current baseline says 60 days, used to say 90 days, because forcing frequent password expirations introduces its own problems. And if it's not a given that passwords will be stolen, you acquire those problems for no benefit. Further, if your users are the kind who are willing to answer surveys in the parking lot in exchange a candy bar for their passwords, no expiration policy will help you. Seriously, the people who write their documentation have gotten so much better. So we've told users to put complex passwords in place. Then we've told them, no, that's stupid, don't do that. Then we told them that we're not going to expire their passwords anymore unless there's an indication of compromise. But do users actually know when they've been compromised? Have we taught them how to know that? So then in 2021, Microsoft makes the bold, amazing, meaningless leap to passwordless. And I say bold and exciting because it actually did remove the password attribute from the credential pair. It simply physically doesn't exist. It's gone. But the document up here says that this is also applies to, I might have even cut it off here. The document says that this also applies to commercial. And I was like, whoa, that's amazing. If they got rid of the passwords in Active Directory, my job is done, right? Or Azure AD, my job is done. This is so much easier. Yeah, except it doesn't do that, right? It renders that password value less useful, but it doesn't actually remove the attribute. So a user still does have a password, and guess when they get to see it? When it expires, because nobody took the advice of any of the last 4 slides, right? We all still have password expirations. We're all still enforcing complexity. We all still do all this kind of fun stuff, right? So again, you wouldn't think that this would have been such a world-torching solution or introduction based on all the things that have come up, but I still present to organizations every single day that have no idea that any of that has happened. And so a couple days after it came out, I did a lot of research scrambling to try to figure out, again, to the point of like, does this mean Azure Active Directory doesn't have passwords anymore? And we found that there is actually an on-premises quasi-equivalent, right? How many of us have Skrillbit enabled in Active Directory for any users? Ooh, okay. How many of us have hybrid users that exist on-prem and in the cloud? Okay. How many of us have enabled on-premises users that never use on-premises actions of any sort? Right? Okay. So I saw a few hands. You can enable the Skrillbit, which is secure card required for interactive logon, on that account, and that makes it a password managed account in Active Directory where AD writes some preposterously huge, presumably the written works of Shakespeare, password every single day and rotates it, and the user cannot authenticate on-prem. But critically, it doesn't disable the account. So if the user still needs to log on to a cloud resource, the Active Directory account is protected, it can't be used, but the Azure AD account doesn't receive that overwrite like you would traditionally get in a password hash sync. So really neat thing. If this is something that you're concerned about where on-premises users are basically parked, but they have to exist and they have to be enabled for replication, you can turn on the Skrillbit for that user and move on to the next problem. That is not a challenge that needs to be on your plate, and it won't affect what we're going to be talking about. So again, to go back, 3,000 plus years of cultural messaging that passwords are super awesome, they're super clever, and they're ways to maintain secure access. And there's literally no way anybody could ever guess my password because it's mine, right? It exists only in my head. But that compares to 30 years of telling everybody you're doing it wrong. No matter how you're doing it wrong. So when I was at DoD in 2001, anybody do DoD or government work? Okay. So anybody survived a CAC rollout or whatever the replacement is for CAC these days? So CAC rollout, or CACs, Common Access cards, were kind of the government's first implementation of smart card required for login. Most of us had them around our necks here. Sorry for the microphone jostle. And when we built this system, it was certificate authorities and responders and all this kind of fun stuff, and then you had to go down to the CAC office and get your card issued to you, and in order for them to hand it to you, you had to put it in the machine and you had to put in a code, a PIN. This was 22 years ago, and every 6 months you had to go back down to the CAC office and have your PIN changed. And every single time on this base of 3,500 people, there would be a line out the door no matter what day you went, because everybody would stand there looking at the machine. Honey, just use your phone number, it's what we all do, was the universal answer given by the person behind the desk. So now this card that has your name on it and that you're going to forget and leave on your desk when you go to lunch, all I need is it and a phone book to look up your phone number, and I've bypassed everything that we've just done. But wait, it gets worse, because now we are dealing with pins that are centrally stored, right? So part of this hot garbage thing that we've been doing to users is telling them in the last few years that pins are amazing. They're so much better than passwords, right? Because it's device specific. But we spent 20 years telling them that they should be cycling their pins and keeping them in a centrally located database. So our messaging has actually been the problem, right? We have not given users the tools that they need to be successful with, getting a little scrolly there. We haven't given them the tools, right? So in all of these permutations and variations of how we've told users to protect their identity, the one thing that hasn't gone away for them is that they still have to maintain their own password. So no matter what all of us knuckleheads keep thinking we're doing by changing the rules every 2 years, they still have to have a password. And that has actually created a scenario where the users really do fundamentally believe we are idiots, they are still protected by changing a password, and there's no way it can be beaten. And that's an actual real statement, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But the reality is, right now, this is just some cherry-picked statistics, 30% of internet users have been breached due to passwords. Most of us who are so proud of those amazing passwords we're recycling them across all kinds of different systems, but they are really just keyboard runs, the word password, and our spouse's, children's, whatever company name with the current month, right? That is what the state of password management is today. And the last two stats on my list here were taken from my favorite bit of annual light reading, which is the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, which is actually going to provide stats for the next few things we're going to talk about. But it's a great rehash. I highly recommend it. It's not quite as good as the Microsoft Learn documentation, but it does kind of give us a great overview of what's been important in the last year, where we need to be thinking about, and what's happening. So, the big number that we're currently selling all of our users, right? Because we've gone through security questions and pins and all that kind of fun stuff. The big one is you can reduce your attack footprint or attackable identity space by 99%, 99.9%, holy moly, by enabling MFA. This is a bold, huge, and insane number that honestly, if I'm a user, I'm like, that's too good to be true, right? I mean, I'm a user, and you've put me through this so many times already. Okay, sure, right? We have given them no reason to trust this, basically, is what I'm getting at. And Microsoft actually uses this number interchangeably based on different scenarios they're trying to sell the story. And if you list the way that they use it in their documentation, the uses are very different. And if I'm looking for holes in this strategy as a user, I'm going to say, well, wait, did you block 99%, or would you have blocked 99.9%? That's a different statement, right? So, again, the Digital Defense Report is a great thing here too, and it talks about the challenges that Microsoft has seen in organizations that are dealing specifically with enterprise SKUs over the last 12 months. And I cherry-picked some of these, I left some out, but what I thought was really interesting in looking at this is that we have done a good job, all of us in the room, and I really do mean that we have done a good job at plugging some of the critical gaps in our infrastructures. A few years ago, the whole usable and immutable backups thing was way off the charts, right? Most of us, if we were taken down in a ransomware incident, we weren't coming back from it easily. We have done a great job of landing the messaging around EDR and SIM, right? Everybody got an EDR, everybody got a SIM? You don't have to show me your hands, I trust you. But boy, howdy, we have some authentication challenges. So, we still have huge gaps. 98% of customers were still supporting legacy authentication protocols and excessive admin assignments. 98% on both of those. And similarly high values for unenforced or bypassable MFA. You'll notice that admins do not get off cleanly either. And every day on the internet, I see red teamers and pen testers sharing stories about the dangers of replicating on-prem admin accounts to the cloud every day. You don't need to show me your hands because, again, I trust that none of you are doing that. And the other thing that's interesting, too, with that is that admins are really bad about recycling passwords, too. When I was at the government, your username for your regular work and your username for your admin work had one value different in the presentable portion of the credential. And I know for an absolute fact that if I had smacked the hash values of one password against the other for almost everybody on the team, they would have matched up, right? But we tend to think, well, they're separate, so there's no way you're not going to get through that. Or maybe they've gotten clever and added a 1 to it, or maybe it's warning point 14, right? So our users and our admins are both really, really terrible, where admins actually only get slightly better values. But the other thing that admins know about Active Directory, and I'm sorry if I'm calling anybody out who's been using this for the last 20 years, admins don't have to change their passwords. Admins can right-click on an account name, reset password, and reset it to its current value. And so that means that right now, in your organizations, there is a very high likelihood that somebody has actually never changed their admin password, irrespective of expiration policies. And let's just sit with that for a second. I presented that to a boardroom one time, and the IT guy got up and walked out of the room. So Admins continue to outperform standard users in Microsoft enterprise adoption of MFA, but honestly, we're not doing that much better than the standard users, right? So the trends over time, when we first started saying they're 99.9%, right? We were at about 10%. Users have steadily risen to about 26%, with a predictable rise, dip, and rise again across the pandemic. We didn't actually have statistics for admins for a while. I don't know why, but we didn't. But they are not actually growing as quickly as users. And this is 2022's, not again, I didn't tell you that before. This is 2022's numbers. We're waiting to see what they're going to be for this year, but I am actually hearing that the numbers are still below 40%. So we are out here beating a big drum, telling users they got to do a whole lot of work, but we ain't doing it, right? That's a you problem. So all of this has led up to a scenario where we now have, in Azure Active Directory alone, 18 different supported authentication mechanisms. And that's just for users, right? That's not counting service identities or applications or anything like that. This is 18 different authentication mechanisms that users can bring to bear today. And so the idea is much like, looking at the evolution of Windows, we're never going to de-support anything. We're just going to keep adding things to the mix and tell you, please don't use these things. And there's a term, so what this ends up doing, before I get to that, what this ends up doing is it creates more confusion and it slows adoption further, right? We, as people who are responsible for protecting networks, how do we know which ones are the right ones until users complain they can't get in? Or the board comes and says the CEO got hacked again, right? So we have all these different things that slows down adoption. It makes it very difficult. And honestly, it makes it very confusing for IT owners to try to figure out how to move forward, right? I have too many options, what do I do? And this was actually really well researched and studied in a JAM study in supermarkets several years ago. Some of you may have heard of this, but basically the researchers went into a supermarket with a table. They set up on the end of an aisle, and they, on some days, would put 6 jars of jam out there with labels and pretty stuff and a whole shelf of beautiful jams you could buy behind you. On other days, they would go and put 24 jars of jam, and you could come up and you could taste any 2 that you wanted to, right? Which days do you think they sold more jars of jam? They didn't sell any jam. Which days do you think they sold more jars of jam? The days when they put out 6 flavors or the days when they set out 24? 6. Why? Yes, right? So I spent years thinking this was called option overload. It's actually, they call it choice overload, whatever. But then they repeated the results with chocolates. Then they repeated the results with something else. What they found was the more things they put out, the more interest the display got. But people would walk up and go, woo, and walk away, right? And that's what we're seeing too when it comes to how do we move forward with our passwordless and MFA journeys. So the unexpected but practical result of this, unfortunately, has also been to see more organizations retreating back into worse authentication mechanisms. I have been brought in several times in the last few years to consult and give final blessings on ADFS implementations, where no ADFS existed before. And I'm talking about since 2016 and beyond. And it's alarming. If you don't know what ADFS is, it's Active Directory Federation Services. A lot of organizations use this to present portions of their identities out to internet service providers. Office 365 very famously accepts ADFS as an authentication mechanism. It is terrible. Please don't ever do it. In fact, Microsoft now officially states, please don't ever do this. This is a very bad idea, and we can help you export your claims from your current ADFS implementation to a raw Office 365 so that you please don't ever do this. But fundamentally, what we're creating is in the IT executive suite, right, because we have those, leaders are getting to the point where they're saying, I don't understand any of the current scenarios, so I'm just going to build it myself with something I understand. And that sounds a heck of a lot like a user saying, I still understand that my password is secure, so I'm going to go back to using that. So we actually are applying systems at scale that reflect the same choices that we're imposing on our users. So let's talk about some of the additional barriers that are not simply user-based, right? We are still supporting workloads that are designed in disparate and legacy systems. And some of the organizations that are in here in my company, we're very fortunate to be born in the cloud. We have no legacy systems to support, so it costs me nothing to say 99.9% and why aren't you on board, right? But there are plenty of organizations out there that are still supporting things like 20-plus-year-old AS400 systems that are backed with 6-character authentication, and maybe there's a long-standing terrible corporate policy that says users have to have a standardized login experience. So none of this complexity and foolishness. And those password policies replicate to and overwrite our cloud databases of identity, right? So we're bringing in terrible identity, terrible security, and what we have experienced is that a lot of these organizations, as they come into the cloud, that's the first time they are discovering, oops, I've been hacked and it's been here for years. And you did it! It's your cloud thing that made me hacked. Whoa, hold on, chief, right? What you're actually experiencing is the first time you're seeing pain for the choices that you made some years ago. We've also supported organizations where there's no consideration at all of unified identity management, right? Last year, I attended an identity and access management meetup group where a CISO, I wish I could exaggerate this, I really do. He's on screen, and he leans back and he puts his feet up on his desk, and he starts running his fingers through his hair and telling us about he's got 17 different sources of identity he's got to manage in both his customer and enterprise systems. And I'm like, you're boasting about that, right? That's 17 different systems that all have different authentication requirements and mechanisms where some passwords aren't acceptable because they contain ASCII characters that aren't supported in other ones. That is a terrible, terrible, terrible thing to be bragging about. Also, they've been taken down a couple times too in big wild public takedowns. Anyway, and again, admins are no better too, because one of my former colleagues once tallied up the list of accounts she was responsible for, and it was actually over 50 separate accounts she had to maintain access into to do her daily job, right? So, again, we're looking at this concept that the complexity of a system defines its value, and that is completely erroneous. We have to move beyond that. But then there's also the trouble of users or the admins who believe that their users would revolt, right? We hear that all the time. My users are revolt. I haven't been able to find an MFA system that scales for all of my users, and so we're not going to do anything. But then there's also the actual fundamental challenge of you cannot guarantee that you have access to this device in everybody's pocket. And this is something that is fundamentally challenging for a lot of organizations, right? This is a privilege. This is something that has only existed for 15 years, and yet we assume that everybody's got one. Not only do they not all have one, and I've met real people who actually don't have one. I just gave my teenage son one for the first time last year, right? He couldn't authenticate using MFA before. But there are a lot of people in your organizations today who are prohibited from accessing their devices during work hours, right? You have frontline workers who are not allowed to pull a phone out and you're telling them to do MFA. Well, okay, you've run into an actual human challenge. You cannot simply tell them to just do harder, right? There's no mechanism for that. So what we have to do is we have to look back and see what is available to us in our systems. And this is where we start getting back into the difference between what was there in February and what's here today. So authentication mechanisms authentication methods in Azure AD have existed for some time. This used to be a really short list. It's progressively grown over the last couple of years. But we have the ability to assign authentication methods to users, to groups. We can offer exclusions if we need to. But we can turn them on or turn them off, or we can assign them. And that's it. That's all you can do. An authentication method is on or off for a certain set of users. That is not enough, right? Because that doesn't give you the ability to say, well, hey, if Johnny's in a forklift operator and he just needs to check his email, but somebody else is also an email user and they need to be able to do this, that, and the other. We're not able to compare the disparate capabilities of those authentication methods in a conditional access policy. That capability simply did not exist in February. But what we did have the ability to do was to grant access but force people into MFA. Right back where we started. Can't pull the phone out of your pocket, can't authenticate. But a lot has changed, right? One of the first major plays that happened as a result of submitting this in February and having to speak on it today is that Microsoft introduced the Authenticator Lite baked into Outlook Mobile. So users who've been saying for years, yeah, you can do whatever you want, but you're going to buy me a phone to do it, or I'm not putting another app on my phone. We've now actually streamlined that experience now so we can deliver it in-app. so that it actually improves the user experience. Remember, we're trying to minimize our footprint on the user's devices while also giving them the same experience as somebody in the boardroom. And Authenticator Lite actually really does do that. And that was just announced in March. It became generally available in May and was transitioned to default on just last week. So like all of this stuff is happening like right now. We also got in what has to be the shortest preview window in the history of a Microsoft product, the ability to design and deploy authentication strengths. And this begins with these 3 pre-canned policies of MFA, passwordless, and phishing-resistant MFA. But you can actually introduce up to 15 more custom authentication methods, or sorry, authentication strengths. And what's really neat here is that these strengths are a mishmash of everything that we've seen so far. So if you have a specific scenario that says users must be able to log on with SMS as a single factor, don't do that. Password plus SMS, and magically FIDO2 key with some kind of custom revocation list, you can put those things together and build a single authentication strength that you can then present to a conditional access policy. Again, please don't put those 3 things together. You can also now evaluate the usage and registration of users into these systems. And you can see how they've enabled their authentications. You can see how many of your users are incapable of it based on the groups that you've put them in, the capabilities that they have, what they've registered for, what they've signed up for. And then you can actually get in and pull a specific list of your actual users and see attribute by attribute what they're able to do, right? Now, one thing that's interesting about this, and this is where this work is not complete, and it's very obviously not complete, is I want to take those users and I want to put them in a dynamic list, a dynamic group, right? And I want to target that dynamic group with training. And I want to target that dynamic group with some sort of conditional access policy that recognizes who they are and eventually drains the list as they get better. I can't do that. There is no ability right now in dynamic group memberships to evaluate any of those fields. You can pull it in PowerShell, which means you can throw it to a logic app and do something special and fancy with it, but it is not in the systems yet. So the other thing that happened, because things just keep happening, is that system-preferred MFA went generally available. And you get this guy by checking this magical box down here that I don't like, called Microsoft Managed, right? And this started appearing in some of our Azure AD controls a few months ago. But what it does, if you really stop and think about it, is it takes you out of the job of trying to keep up with what's the latest and greatest authentication hot sauce, right? I don't have time for that. This makes managing security protocols a service provided by Microsoft. A service, and I don't have to do it anymore. That's what got me out of Lotus Notes into Exchange Online. So I highly encourage, don't be scared of that. And the neat thing here too is that that button is going to be enforced on by the end of, I think, next month, and they're going to take away the ability to modify it. All you'll be able to do is exclude users from it as you need. All right, that's not all, right? Because if they had simply enabled all of those previous features, they would have put every single Office 365 tenancy on the planet into immediate license invalidation, right? Because all of those things bring MFA to users, but traditionally Azure AD only allows global admins to be MFA enabled. But now with Authenticator and Authenticator Lite, we can actually enable it for all users. And this is actually very similar to what Twitter did just a few months ago too, right? We're removing SMS as the second factor for unverified accounts, for unpaid accounts, right? It seemed very disruptive, but it was a paid service, so why were they going to keep paying for it? This is very much the same. It costs Microsoft nothing to send a notification to your mobile app. Oh, speaking of the mobile app notifications, number matching also went GA as of, I think, last month it was? Yeah, right? So users are no longer being susceptible, or they're no longer susceptible to push fatigue simply by being enrolled in using their mobile app. They actually have to type in the number or match it on a 3-digit code thing and actually indicate that it is them. And again, this is one of those things where if you put it to Microsoft Managed, location information is expected to become part of this experience in the next few months. So what do we do, right? How can we do this? We need to identify our users, some sort of programmatic method, right? The tooling exists to identify these users, but there's no automatic capabilities yet to capture them. We need to identify their capabilities and continue to drive them forward. We need to identify the apps that they need to work with and the level of access that they need into those apps, and then we need to isolate those apps and accesses to reduce the risk to our environment. And the cool thing is we can do all of that, right? None of this is theory. Everything here is just practical implementation. Conditional access policies are designed to do exactly this. So if you ever tried to work with Microsoft conditional access policies, you know they're absolute garbage to look at on a screen. There's a guy named Merrill Fernando who developed a tool called ID Power Toys. It's free. Go get it. It's not a Microsoft product. He's a PM, but he makes this free. Light it up as an OAuth application in your app registrations, and you're done. But what it gives you is this ability to export your conditional access policies. So I have two policies here defined completely on sample data for giving my MFA hesitant users access into the systems they need to do their job. And we're going to exercise different constraints around them differently from other users. So in my first one, I have all my users need to be able to get to these three apps, a training app and a couple of other productivity apps, right? But I'm going to exclude my MFA hesitant users, and I'm going to enforce that they come in with phishing resistant MFA. Simple, right? Everybody who's coming to this app needs to be MFA, except these people. Oh, if you are one of these people, you have additional constraints. You now must be coming from an Azure Active Directory joined device, and you have to be inside the Richmond or the Raleigh office. If you meet those constraints, then you are forced into using a different authentication strength, which is the one that we custom created earlier. So we can now do everything that was just theoretical 4 months ago. It's literally a checkbox. It's literally a checkbox in a conditional access policy. The problem, though, is that it's not complete, right? I already said you can't query the users the way you need to, but you also are constrained to one authentication strength in a conditional access policy. So there's no way to programmatically give users options and reduce those options as they go forward. What that's going to rely on is another thing called authentication contexts, which is so like really terribly documented and not fully developed, and please don't use it because it won't work. All right, so circling back to the users, right? There are users who, no matter how many barriers we remove, are still going to be challenging to support. And we hear this all the time, right? Not a big deal, but Matthew Inman, creator and author and illustrator of The Oatmeal, has a great article called The Backfire Effect. And he deals with people being challenged about things that are core to their belief systems and how they will fight it forever. There's no way that you're going to get through to them. So we have to understand that that's a real thing, but we also have to continue to address change in our organizations, right? This was all cherry-picked from a great blog post out there from primeeast.com. I got the URLs for anybody who wants to read it. But essentially, there are 6 major ways to deal with overcoming change, right? Communication, education, support, participation, all this kind of fun stuff. But if we are very honest with ourselves, most of us have gone to number 6 by default. Coercion, right? Read it here. Let me scroll down so I can get to my actual statement here. Let's see. Well, here, I'll just read it. Where people feel like they cannot learn the new skills needed, or if they feel that the change is a temporary fad that will be reversed. Sound a little bit familiar to what we've taught them over the last 30 years. Everything that we're going to do is going to be undone. And this is a lot like people who fundamentally believe that Pluto is still a planet, right? They have reached their elastic limit for change, and we're not going to reach them. So we have to be better about moving off of number 6 and moving back into 1 through 5. All right. There's a great study on on exploring MFA resistance published by the University of Hawaii at Manoa. In it, they broke down respondents into IT experts and non-experts, and they asked them about the challenges that they face in dealing with adopting MFA. But generally what they found was that non-experts believe that MFA provides them nothing. Their password is secure enough. There's no way a phone can be broken into. None of this is possible, right? You're all just trying to get me to change something, and you don't know what you're talking about. But when it came to protecting things that mattered to them, so we're moving away from protecting their access to corporate resources, when it mattered to them, they were willing to do MFA. They didn't understand why, but they understood fundamentally that it offered some level of protection, and any level of additional protection when protecting access to the stuff I care about is worth it. So when we go back to talking about how that matters for corporate spaces, we need to ensure that users truly feel like they are a participant in the change process, that this is not a reversible fad, that we as security researchers must continue to protect users, and we got to get the phones out of the equation, right? These same people said that they would be open to talking about security keys. They are generally resistant to biometrics, and I'm going to leave you, because he's about to show me the stop talking button. I'm going to leave you with a brief story about biometrics, right? So we have all been using fingerprints, we've all been using faces, we hear about irises. There is a golden standard for biometrics. It has to be globally unique, has to be presentable on demand but generally not visible, has to be presentable on demand without breaking any laws or rules of decorum. What do you think might be the next frontier that researchers have already looked into for the next biometric object or attribute?
Is it your tongue or your ear?
You got it on the first try. It's a tongue print. Yeah. Yes, because even when you're speaking, nobody sees your tongue, right? Now, nobody's suggesting that you go out and like lick a door to get into it, but I honestly would not be surprised to see in a few years security bros rolling hardcore up to the data center door and sticking out their tongues like school children to get access, right? Anyway, that's all I got. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of your conference.